Welcome to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, December 2nd, 2021, and we are streaming live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. And we thank you for joining us. I'm Mary Massey with my terrific co host, John SAKOWICZ. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary. I'm not that terrific. We have got a great show today. It may seem a little strange to talk about the defense budget during the holiday season, but actually, it's not. When you think that this is the season of peace on earth, goodwill towards all men and women, we need to think about the things that are funded in our name. So we can't wait to hear from our guest. Top secret security clearance, retired from the Air Force, a real expert on our defense budget and who profits from the defense budget. But before we kick off, I want to give a quick plug for the best holiday gift I can think of, and that's a membership at your community radio station, KMUD. Now, Mary and I are both members, and we've recruited a lot of our friends to be members, including the matching gift from the Guggenheim Foundation. We have on my Facebook page on my birthday, that was the GoFundMe page. We recruited some members there too. And the reason why we're so enthusiastic is because there are many key differences between public radio and community radio. And if you don't think so, I've consulted an expert on that topic, and her name is Donica Messing, and she is the associate dean of the Reynolds School of Journalism in the University of Nevada, Reno. And this is what she has had to say about the differences between public radio and community radio. Both, of course, are not-for-profit models. Both receive some public funding, and both are operated in the public interest. But much public radio is affiliated with NPR, and we're going to hear a little bit about NPR.
We are indeed from our guests. In corporate media.
And what corporate media does. And community radio is more focused on the local community. Now, our show, we like to say, we broadcast to the world. People listen to our web stream of our show from all over the world. But we are a community, a global community. This show is a global community. The staff who works at KMUD are fewer in number than in most public radio stations. They receive a fraction of the salaries that most public radio executives get, and the focus is clearly on volunteer driven. There are no hidden agendas. There are no gatekeepers. It's really a populist model.
Yeah,
and it's why we do our show here. We love that model. We love the fact that this is people-powered radio. I'll keep coming back to that. This is people-powered radio. And if you believe in the power of the people, I think you should become a member. Or if you already have a membership, we thank you. And we hope that you give a membership to someone that you love and invite them into this community, into this family of loving, informed, progressive people that KMUD truly is.
Our volunteers have already raised $36,000, and we would very much like for you as listeners to give the gift of radio this year. You can do that by going online and at the website, kmud.org, and push the donate button. I did it, and it was painless. So let's get on with the show, John. We'll talk about that more later. We also have a special guest coming up in January that you wanted to mention, January 6th on our program.
Yes, we're hoping to get our Congressman Jared Huffman on the show on January 6th, finalizing the details with his scheduler and his press secretary. I want to remind listeners that Congressman Huffman is having a telephone town hall tonight, December 2nd at 5:30 p.m. The teleconference can be logged into by calling 833-261-6164. Repeat, 833-261-6164.
Wonderful.
And participants are encouraged to ask questions live. So that's great. Again, we have a populist congressman.
And we have another service offered by KMUD. Today's show and all programs will be archived here at kmud.org and at our program website, heroespatriots.org. We invite you as listeners to call in with questions for our guests, 707-923-3911. We will take as many calls as our time permits and ask that you be brief. Our thanks to KMUD engineer Dorothy Secure for all year assisting us with the production of today's program.
Right on.
So claps and kudos to her.
Yay.
Views and opinions expressed during this program do not necessarily reflect those of the board, staff, or volunteers of KMUD Community Radio. Let's get on with the program. Christian Sorensen is an independent journalist and researcher mainly focused on war profiteering within the military-industrial Congressional complex. An Air Force veteran, he is the author of Understanding the War Industry. Sorensen is also a senior fellow at Eisenhower Media Network, an organization of independent veteran military and national security experts. And his work, John, is available at War Industry Muster, MUSTER.com. So we now welcome first-time guest, Christian Sorensen. Christian, good morning.
Hey, good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yes. I wanted to start off with your book, Understanding the War Industry, and you list three main reasons for the United States supporting and deploying the military. One was to forcibly open up countries to foreign investment. Two, to ensure the free flow of natural resources from the global south in the hands of the multinational corporations. And three, which is really what we're talking about and which our opening song is, War Racket, because war is profitable. The third of these three reasons, is the profitability of war. It's often lacking detail and analysis of U.S. imperialism. The financial industry, including investment banks and private equity firms, is an insatiable force seeking profit via military activity. Let's start there. That third reason, it's profitable. Tell us how that model works.
Correct. So the banking industry or the financial industry writ large sits at the top of the war industry. Now, the war industry, we should back up a little bit and first define what the military-industrial Congressional complex is. So if you picture a triangle, there are three sides, obviously. The military side is represented by the Pentagon. It's the military establishment. It is the headquarters of all U.S. military activity. Another side is industry. This is the war industry. These are the corporations that develop, market, and sell goods and services to the U.S. military and to U.S. intelligence and to allied capitalist governments around the world. And then the third side, as you alluded to, is Congress. And Congress's job within this triangle is basically to fund the permanent warfare state and to pass legislation favorable to nonstop war. So to answer your question, that arrangement of sort of authority in the United States is why we're always at war. And sitting at the top of the war industry side of the triangle is the financial industry, because the big banks are the largest institutional holders of the stock of the major war corporations. So if you look at Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, all of these, they must maximize short-term profit every quarter. And in order to do that, they do their best to capture government and to sort of keep the permanent warfare state going.
If we could get you to speak a little closer to your phone there,
Sure.
You're fading in and out. Go ahead.
So did you catch all that? What did you?
Yes, we did.
We did. I'm going to jump in, Christian, if I may.
Sure.
It seems like the last war that we fought for the defense of our country you know, in the name of national security was World War II. And ever since then, Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, the insane wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have all been wars of adventurism, all wars that fit into this whole notion of yours, not yours. You know, a lot of our guests have pointed this out, that war is a business, and then not just a business, but America's business, the business. It's the engine of our economy. So my question is this: how did it come to pass that the whole notion of why we fight wars, the pretext for fighting wars, shifted from true national defense to fighting wars for profit? When did that paradigm shift happen, and how did it happen?
Sure, excellent question. The origins are in the first basic war of imperial aggression that the U.S. government engaged in was the Spanish-American War, and after that, the U.S. military was a global empire. It was down in the Philippines, it was down in Latin America, and it basically came to how do you say this? After most conflicts, the U.S. military draws down, and this was the same to an extent after the Spanish-American War. But when World War II came around, after that, the standing military remained. There was a decision made in Washington, D.C. not to demobilize. And in part, the reason was because it had, at that point, had become such a huge business. And so what George Carlin once said, which is so important, is that fascism didn't get defeated during World War II. The Third Reich did lose, but fascism remained. Now, where did it remain? How did it continue on? Fascism comes in different forms over the course of global history. However, what we have here in the United States, in the form of permanent warfare, the permanent warfare state, the military-industrial complex, is fascism. What is fascism? Fascism is when big business blends with federal government, on top of which you sprinkle nationalism, lots and lots of nationalism. And that's what we have in the military-industrial congressional complex. It is a permanent warfare state. Now, the end of the Second World War saw no substantial drop in the standing army. And furthermore, at that point, you had such immense authority in the war industry that they wouldn't let it happen. They absolutely wouldn't let it happen. And Harry S. Truman basically kept or was forced to keep the war machine going. And so it was codified in the 1947 National Security Act. The National Security Act established CIA. It established the Air Force as a separate branch from the Army, and it entrenched the standing military. And we've been dealing with that ever since. So if you have to point to one single act of legislation that basically brought the fascism home to the United States in a very subtle but pernicious form, it was the National Security Act of 1947. And ever since then, as you pointed out, we have been at nonstop war around the globe under various pretexts, whether it was Korea, 1950, 1953, whether it was our support initially for the French in Southeast Asia, and then we took over from them in the 60s and 70s under a very shady pretext, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which many historians these days assert actually maybe even never even happened, but it was a great cause for war. It's a great cause, pretext that you can point to and say, hey, we got to go in there. And overall, the point I'm trying to make is that if there is no reason for war, the permanent warfare state will find one. It will create one. It will justify one. Otherwise, it will interpret the defensive maneuvers of official enemies of the day as aggressive maneuvers, thereby justifying greater U.S. military buildup and expansion. And from the point of view of the U.S. war industry, that is to say, the boardrooms and the corporate suites of the large and middle-sized war corporations, that comprise the war industry, you have bases, military bases around the globe, but those are not bases per se. They are facilities through which you, the war corporation, route profit. And they look at the troops, the soldier, sailor, airman, and marine, as, yes, obviously as numbers, but most soldiers, sailors, airmen, and marine are not cannon fodder as they were during, say, World War I. These days, they are merely vessels for corporate profit. They are vessels through which giant corporations route profit. And so the third reason that you mentioned at the top of the show for our permanent warfare state around the world, for our garrisoning the globe, is because war is big business. And big business wins through the nonstop war, but it also wins, as you pointed out, because our garrisoning of the globe has allowed multinational capital to go into countries like we saw with Iraq in 2003 and liberalize their economies. Saddam had most of the Iraqi economy prior to 2003 in state hands, including the agricultural sector. One of the first things that L. Paul Bremer, the U.S. Viceroy, did upon arrival to Iraq was to liberalize the economy, not just oil, which was one of the main reasons, obviously, but also agriculture and everything else, and telecoms and everything else. So that is one of the reasons. So yeah, great point.
Christian, I want to loop back to, in a second, I want to loop back to how other countries' defensive maneuvers are deliberately misinterpreted as being pretext for war and how that relates to our current government looking at some of the moves made by China and Russia, both as possible pretext for war. But first, I want to congratulate you for for differentiating the difference between Nazism and fascism. Now, if you and I were to go to the Humboldt County Courthouse and say that America was a fascist state, we'd probably be arrested within the hour on a 5150 charge and put into, an involuntary psychiatric commitment. We would be called screaming lunatics.
Sure.
But you are exactly right. Fascism is when corporate oligarchs run the country. And we have a long history of that. In pre-World War II, Prescott Bush was one of the 7 directors of the Union Banking Corp, a New York investment bank owned by the Thyssen family in Germany. Fritz Thyssen was Hitler's key financial supporter at the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
Exactly.
And it wasn't even Prescott Bush. You had Henry Ford, who built trucks for the Nazis. You had Joe Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy family, a U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, who had to be recalled because he was embarrassingly pro-Hitler.
Exactly. And IBM helped make some of the tabulating machines for the Third Reich, and General Motors helped get their industry established and up and running in the 30s. So great point.
Exactly. So before we come back to the present day and what the new pretext for wars will be, just give our listeners a little bit of a history lesson as to how fascism is so deeply embedded in American business and in the American way of life and in the way we govern.
Sure. It's also important to point out that when Hitler and the quote-unquote, founding fathers of the Third Reich were trying to establish their doctrine in the early 30s and sort of getting everything up and running, they pointed to the entrenched racial laws in this country, including but not limited to the Jim Crow laws, as a model upon which to base many of the Third Reich's laws as they were developing and getting going. And they also, even in Hitler's horrible book, Mein Kampf, he noted, unfortunately quite accurately, that the U.S. was founded on ethnically cleansing the native population and built upon black labor. Now, obviously, he used that as a good thing, which is obviously it was not. But the facts speak nonetheless. And yes, as you point out, the country has always been for and by the 1% of the 1%, but that is
Right.
not necessarily inherently fascistic. What happens is when that ruling class and their big businesses sufficiently take over government policy. And so what I point to is the National Security Act of 1947 as sort of the defining moment when big business in the form of giant war corporations succeeded in basically capturing government. And unfortunately, a lot of people throw around the term fascism these days, and they do it in an incorrect manner. So some conservatives, for example, might say, "Oh, Antifa's making me do things. They're making me they're making me protest. They're making me this and that, and that's fascist." No, that is not fascism. And then on the other hand, you have some liberals and some mainstream Democrats who say, "Oh, well, hey, we voted fascism out of office. Trump's no longer in office, so we're good to go." No, you cannot vote fascism out of office. Fascism is a real phenomenon with a concrete definition, and that is the blending of big business with government, and you sprinkle a bunch of nationalism on top. And it came actually, the first modern form of fascism came in the 1920s in Italy. The word itself comes from the Italian word, I think, fascio, which means an association or group, and that itself was derived from a Latin word, fascis, which means bundle, like a grouping. And so that's what when you bundle big business and government together, that's sort of the etymology of the whole thing. That's exactly what we have these days with the permanent warfare state in the form of
and isn't it true that since 9/11, there's almost no checks and balance on our propensity to go to war? It's it wasn't just the Homeland Security Act or the U.S. Patriot Act, but there are other war resolutions that give the president almost unilateral power to go to war. Catch our listeners up on that history lesson too.
So and this stuff creeps over time, and so even in the lead up to 9/11, you saw a few a few provisions, legislative bills being passed in Congress to sort of pave the way, and so these things gain momentum over the time. And so, for example, you had President Clinton signing something known as Presidential Decision Directive 25, PDD 25. This is an executive order that reportedly exempts portions of the U.S. military from the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, I believe. Now, Posse Comitatus was basically saying, hey, look, the U.S. military cannot get involved in domestic police operations. There needs to be a distinct line drawn there. And that act, the Posse Comitatus Act, drew a very firm line there. And what Clinton did with that executive order signed in, I think it was May of 1994, he basically said, look, Joint Special Operations Command and other quote-unquote elite units within the U.S. military are allowed to operate on U.S. soil. So the fascism slowly builds. Another thing Clinton did, and I'm not just picking on Clinton here, what I'm pointing out is that whether you are on the blue team, the blue faction of the ruling class, or the red faction of the ruling class, you are still capitalist and you are still embedded within this permanent warfare state. So another thing Clinton did was the Iraqi Liberation Act of 1998. Yes, George W. Bush, his successor, was the one who launched the invasion in 2003. But Clinton was the one who paved the way for regime change in Iraq by making it U.S. government foreign policy, by enacting it into law in the form of the Iraqi Liberation Act of 1998. So there are a bunch of these that you can point to that just say, look, if you follow it, if you understand the nature of fascism and the subtle fascism that the U.S. government has, you can see these things existing on a continuum. And you can see how they build over time until you get a pretext like 9/11, which was an awful, horrible tragedy, and the government just jumped on it. You see the beast just unleashed, not just in the form of greater expansive wars overseas and greater garrisoning of the globe, but also turning inward, and now everyone's a suspect. You have a permanent warfare, multiple armed bureaucracies looking inward as well as outward, and we can talk about the history of suppression of dissent in the United States if you want to.
Okay. It's 26 minutes after the hour. If you've just joined the program, this is Heroes and Patriots, and we are speaking with Christian Sorensen. He is an independent journalist and researcher, mainly focused on war profiteering within the military-industrial congressional complex. And all the reviews of your book, Understanding the War Industry, remark at how thorough and complete your research was to compile this book, and also your articles. Could you talk about that process, and was it difficult to get the information to author your book?
Great question. So I got out of the military in 2011, and when I was in, it was a pretty big awakening. People react differently to the propaganda when they're in and when they're out of the military. And I was expecting one thing when I got in, and I soon realized, just by witnessing it, just by being part of the, being part of the cog in the machine, being part of the overall beast, that it's not at all what we are told through corporate media or through Hollywood on the outside. So I did my 4 years, and when I got out, I started researching, and slowly but surely, based on tallying up years and years and years of contract announcements, which are available on the Pentagon's website, I started building up an understanding of who's profiting from permanent war. And I combined that information, which at that point I think was 7 years worth of information, with the incredible work of many independent journalists and a few mainstream journalists who have been investigating this stuff for a long time. And then I took that blend and put it into book format from a progressive standpoint. And I think that's what sort of makes this unique. Is I had the stats to back it up, the actual contract announcements to back up what I was saying, and yeah, it just took a really long time. But I am proud of the end result.
That's wonderful. And again, the comments, the reviews by reputable people have all been positive, and again, remarking how thorough and meticulous your research is to write this book. We're going to take a brief pause here at 9:28. Welcome back to Heroes and Patriots, the program about national security and foreign policy. I'm Mary Massey, along with my co-host here, John SAKOWICZ, and we are speaking with Christian Sorensen this morning. He is an independent journalist and researcher focused on war profiteering, which we've had several guests on this idea of perpetual war, false flags, etc. I wanted to, John talked about NPR, the difference between NPR, what do I want to say?
Public radio versus community radio.
Thank you. I've got NPR in my brain, right, because I have an idea here.
The corporate model versus the community model.
So, Christian, I wanted to ask you, it seems like this whole notion of false flags and dirty, like I think of Iran being planted, false information about. It's all perpetrated, orchestrated. Thank you, by the corporate media, and by that I mean CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. But I have learned that John Lansing, who was made NPR's new CEO in 2019, recently led U.S. propaganda at the U.S. Agency for Global Media. It seems like if they didn't have these folks, this would not be possible. Am I right?
Yeah. So corporate media is almost the key to the whole thing. You have to. We don't exist in a democratic society, but there's still the masses that you need to keep either ignorant or get them to go along with your I hate to use the word agenda, but agenda of permanent warfare. And so at the very basis, you have only a handful of business interests that own the media outlets in the United States. There's something like 5 or 6 giant corporations that own all corporate media that you see. and profit drives corporate media. So, like you said, U.S. corporate media, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, etc., they all operate under the same business model. You air what attracts the highest ratings or gets the most clicks in order to you, the corporation, get the most advertising revenue. And that's the, that's the business model. They might target different sectors. So they might, CNN might target people who, lean toward the blue team, and Fox News might target people who lean toward the red team, but it's the same underlying business model. They do not exist to educate the masses. They air infotainment. There's no desire to foster critical thinking about U.S. foreign policy or domestic policy. Informing the public is not a priority. Maintaining the existing economic order is. And to the extent that corporate media air any credible information whatsoever, that information usually reflects the opinions of the ruling class and its capitalist ideology. So you will not get many, many domestic issues addressed, especially the exploitation of the working class. And you certainly won't get an honest discussion about U.S. foreign policy. And so you have, within that atmosphere, you then have the war industry sort of entering the arena. And what the war industry does is to further confine the debate by purchasing advertisements. So if there's a morning talk show, meet the press type thing, the war industry will purchase advertisements on that. And now, so people are like watching it, and they're like, "Well, I'm not going to buy a submarine. I'm not going to buy a military helicopter. Why are they doing this?" The idea is the hosts really can't and don't go against the advertisers. So it's a way to further make sure, hey, there's not going to be an honest discussion about permanent warfare. And then on top of that, you have career militants, former CIA directors, former deputy directors, retired generals and admirals who join these corporate media outlets as national security pundits and quote-unquote experts. And the retired generals and admirals, the retired CIA directors, in addition to their underlying militancy, invariably have current financial investments in these giant war corporations. So it's really, really insidious. And then, like you pointed out, even a station like NPR, which is held up by certain sectors of the liberal establishment as the beacon on the hill, is run by the person who used to be in charge of one section of U.S. foreign-oriented propaganda. So you can't make this stuff up.
Let that sink in.
Yeah.
The new head of NPR used to run part of our war machine propaganda.
Yeah.
Right.
That's insane.
John Lansing.
That's John Lansing. Don't believe us? Look it up.
Exactly. And then the last piece of this whole puzzle is there used to be a law on the books called the Smith-Mundt Act. And that was back in the day basically saying, hey, look, the sort of public propaganda that you see on Radio Free Liberty, Radio Europe, U.S. Agency for Global Media type stuff that is directed outward is not supposed to be targeted inward. So they drew sort of a fuzzy line back in the day that said, hey, outward-facing propaganda goes outward, and that's that. And what they did in, I think it was 2012 or 2013, they quote-unquote modernized it. So they passed the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, which allowed certain forms of government propaganda on domestic corporate media outlets and channels. And that sort of was the icing on the cake. And so there's no hold bars now. No hold barred now. You can basically anything goes. And once you give the permanent warfare state an inch, it takes a mile. So if you water down an existing law about propaganda, they're going to run with it.
Christian, we have a caller. If you're still listening, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sorensen, you have presented a really important clarifying framework for understanding almost everything we're dealing with today, from climate change to what I want to ask you about, which is China. I'd love for you to apply the deep knowledge you have about the permanent warfare state, including the collusion of the media in this, to talk a little bit about China and whether the gathering of the military-industrial Congressional media complex is now getting prepared, because there isn't a big war around, to make China the next way of building profit.
Great question. So back in maybe, I think it was 2017, going into 2018, there was sort of a consensus within the elites of the military, industry, and Congress that said, look, we have milked the so-called global war on terror for approaching 2 decades now, and it's going to continue, and we'll still be, the 4 corners of the globe fighting glorified gangs, and that will continue to be very, very profitable for our corporate allies. However, we cannot justify huge contracts in nuclear weapons, in submarines, in information technology, in cyber offenses, and on and on and on, in artificial intelligence, in hypersonic missiles, and on and on and on, by pointing to a bunch of glorified gangs in the desert and in Africa and in the mountains of Afghanistan. We simply can't, because those goods and services are not used regularly and forcefully. So if we want to justify, say, a new $1.3 trillion upgrade to our nuclear arsenal and all the other goods and services that I just mentioned, we need a modern industrial power to face off against. And so they looked around and they said, look, we have Moscow and we have Beijing, and that's what we're going to go after. And like we talked about earlier on in the program, anytime Moscow or Beijing moves a muscle or twitches on its own soil, the U.S. military-industrial complex can then leap and say, hey, look, they're building up, they're moving troops inside their own borders. So we have to absolutely invest in A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and on and on and on. And so you saw in legislation getting going in 2017, 2018, and particularly in the war industries, think tanks, and corporate media apparatus, a real push for something called great power competition. And great power competition is basically what we're talking about. It is the new Cold War, except this time around it's against 2. It's against Russia and it's against China. And the war on terror was lucrative for a decade or 2, and it will continue on in different forms. But if you want to spend on satellites, aircraft carriers, machine learning, anti-ballistic missiles, cyber, you need a major industrial power. And that's the decision that was made. And the Pentagon got on stage. You can look at the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which was developed in 2017 by military and corporate personnel. That was basically the defining document that said, all right, we are going to go full speed into the new Cold War. You had, for example, General Joseph Dunford, who declared in, I think it was November of 2018, that great power competition was here to stay. And he did so at a war industry forum sponsored by war corporations. It was called the Halifax International Security Forum. They have it every year. And 4 months later, the war industry pressure group known as the National Defense Industrial Association gave General Dunford its most prestigious award, which was, I think they even called it the Eisenhower Award. And then General Dunford retired and joined the board of Lockheed Martin, as most of his peers do these days. They while they're in uniform, they promote aggressive policies and they build up very, very profitable businesses for the war industry. And then when they get out, they go and join the war industry. And they take their retirement stipend, which is already 6 figures, and they add to that 6 more figures from the war industry. So we can't, part of addressing this situation is to recognize that our officer corps is corrupt to the core. It is absolutely part of the problem. And until we get more moral courage within the Pentagon's walls, we're in a world of hurt.
Christian, my brother, you are way, way ahead of the curve. You are just fantastic, because I was just about to go to the money in the new defense budget for China. Mm-hmm. So as you rightly pointed out, the days of fighting, Stone Age terrorists living in caves armed with only AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenade launchers are over. We're on to bigger and better things. Mm-hmm. I've been in touch with Mike McCord's office. He's the Undersecretary for the Defense Controller and Chief Financial Officer, and also the Office of Navy Vice Admiral Ron Boxwell, who is the Director of Force Structure, Resource, and Assessment for the Joint Staff. And in the original $715 billion defense budget that they proposed. $5 billion is now, it's a new $5 billion. It's in a new category called the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, and the money is going for things like, again, forget the Stone Age terrorists living in caves. The money is now going to fight China in the following areas: artificial intelligence, microelectronics, hypersonics, 5G technology, long-range firepower, space-based systems, New Age shipbuilding, and nuclear modernization. That sounds like a whole new field to plow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's incredibly unfortunate because every dollar spent, there is so much time, money, brain power, effort that goes towards garrisoning the globe. Now, it's beyond brain drain. It is criminal activity insofar as if we allocated a fraction of this time, money, effort, brain power, everything toward improving our collective well-being, we would be in such paradise. It's not even funny. And so it's like it's a triple whammy. They're taking money that discretionary funding that could be going toward and should be going toward the public good, and they are taking it away from the American people. And they, instead of giving it back to the American people, they shove it into permanent warfare, and then that in turn harms the American public, and it harms all of the civilians overseas. Our foreign policy for the past 20 years has been about demonizing, propagandizing against, and then invading and occupying the countries of predominantly black and brown people overseas in the greater Middle East and in Africa and in Southeast Asia, which often goes under the radar because we have troops in the Philippines and whatnot. And so, yeah, like you point out, you have legislation consistently that aids and abets the priorities of the U.S. war industry. And so, you can look back at previous National Defense Authorization Acts that end up going into public law. They would have, stipulations that say, $25 billion for shipyard construction. And that would have been passed, and then you get it you see it. I see it reflected in the contract announcements that come up, the following fiscal year. And so you see it's a direct transfer from U.S. taxpayer into war corporations and corporate priorities. And then go ahead.
A lot of in this testimony between McCord and Boxell before the Defense Appropriations Committee is very consistent with what you said about corporate nationalism and fascism. And I got the transcript of that testimony, and I picked out a key sentence here, a key paragraph, and I'll read it. Vice Admiral Boxell said this: "The strategic landscape is changing. We are witnessing a fundamental shift in the character of war. In particular, China is increasing its military capability at an aggressive rate, and we must ensure that we retain our commercial, competitive, and technological edge against this pacing threat." Mm-hmm. Wow. I mean, they don't even disguise the fact that the military budget is perfectly aligned with corporate interests.
Exactly. And it's important to know, so if you look at like the congressional testimony that you cited and others, the verbiage, the nomenclature, the sayings, the phraseology that these senators and Congress people use is directly from the very think tanks that the U.S. war industry funds. Now, the job of a think tank is to put out information favorable to the profit margins of those who fund the think tank. So you get big oil funding a think tank, and the think tank will put out, hey, the climate catastrophe, it's not that bad, this or that. Or if you're the war industry, you fund think tanks, and they provide the justification and the rationale for garrisoning the globe. And that's what we got. And it's important to then further emphasize, and I cannot say this enough, China's military, to this day, is defensively oriented. It is focused on China, China's coast, and the South China see, it is not a global military power. It is not trying, like the United States has done, to garrison the globe. The U.S. government has hundreds and hundreds of installations, military installations around the world. China has one outside of its country, one, and it's in Djibouti, and it's very minor. So who is the aggressor here? China is purely defensively oriented, and no amount of rational, just look at the situation. No amount of calm rationale can pierce the just blanket propaganda that comes out of the military, that comes out of industry, and that comes out of Congress. So now we've reached a point where China has so thoroughly been demonized in U.S. media that all you have to do now is just say the China threat, and you get whatever you want. It's more funding, it's more funding, and more funding. It's taken as a matter of fact, and we have failed as a public to push back against this.
I've been making myself a pain in the butt in another office as well, and that's a Freedom of Information request out of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's office. Excellent. And I wanted to drill down on some comments that he made at the House Armed Services Committee. I believe it was in May, where he said that the budget that he was proposing, it was, I believe, it was $752 billion at that time. Mm-hmm. And I quote, and I wanted to make sure I did my fact checking. And I quote, he said that the budget to fund the strategy to policy, and the policy, what he said, to the will of the American people. Mm-hmm. So he was matching resources to strategy, matching strategy to policy, and then matching policy to the will of the American people. So my question, my friend, is this. What is the will of the American people? And where are the dissenters? Who's dissenting?
Sure. So the will of the American people, as reflected in polls, despite all of the propaganda that we are fed, and we are swimming in it. We are swimming at the base level in capitalist propaganda, and then the next level in government propaganda, and on and on and on. We are, from day one, we are swimming in it. Despite all of that, polls after polls, when you phrase the question clearly, indicate that the American public doesn't buy a lot of this stuff, doesn't want to go to war, isn't willing to sacrifice for, endless corporate profits. And the American public get it. They understand intuitively, because they're living it in the day-to-day, how rapacious corporate America is, and how as they go about their life, they're getting dinged and pinched, and just corporate America is reaching into their wallet and taking out and charging them at every turn. So the American people just understand this intuitively, and if you look at 2003, when the Bush administration was gearing up for war in Iraq, the American public came out, hundreds of thousands of people said, no, we don't want this. We don't want the war. And 9/11 was still very fresh in people's minds. Right. They were still... Right. No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Long story short, people get it. People understand, and no amount of while propaganda is very successful to some extent, the American people don't buy a lot of it, and proof to that is that there are still many people who, when they have the time, and that's key, push back. There still are dissenters in our society. Part of the problem is we are so drowning in profit over people that most people don't have the time. They're just trying to make ends meet. Even before the COVID pandemic, half of this country was poor or low income. Now that doesn't sound like the American dream to me that we've been fed. The American people are really, really hurting, and they understand on a very visceral level how how corporate America is a vampire, and how the ruling class cannot be satisfied.
I'm led to ask you then, how do we rebalance? How do we reset all of this? Is it boycotting these corporations? Is it how is this possible? How can we turn this around if we're daily being fed infotainment rather than facts? How can it be changed?
So one area where the war industry is not has not fully captured government yet is at the state and local level. So we can still there's still some breathing room there for us to pass local and state ordinances that say, hey, we can divest, for example, our state pension fund from war profiteers, or we can, ban war profiteers from this and that. And there's still some movement there. I have, and this is just speaking personally and not, on behalf of any group here. I have personally just more or less thrown in the towel at the federal level, just because through campaign finance and through lobbying and through taking over more and more military activity, the U.S. war industry has just absolutely succeeded in capturing government. And you see this. You can elect all the progressives in the world, but when I do not see, for example, Bernie Sanders pushing back on matters of war and peace, and he largely toes the line on matters of, hey, let's garrison the globe and this and that. He speaks very well in many areas, but I have not seen a consistent push there, just because there's so much structural pressure on these individuals when they get into office. So there's some movement at the local level, this and that. But if we really are serious as a people, and we really want to end the state of permanent warfare, and we really want to unite with our friends overseas, the Iranian people are not our enemy. The Chinese people are not our enemy. The Russian people are not our enemy. No matter who they call up as the official enemies of the day, these are not our enemies. Our enemies are anybody, whether they're in Paris or London or Washington, D.C., who says that bad guy XYZ overseas is our enemy. Those are the bad guys. Those are the people who are the enemies of the people. And so, long story short, if we actually really are serious, then we need to do whatever we can in our daily lives to support one another and create a new economic system, one that does not put profit over people. Right now, in our capitalist economic system, the workers create the profit, and the ruling class takes the profit, and the ruling class directs the economy. It doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. We can create an economic system where the workers create the profit, and the workers get the profit, and the workers determine the direction of the economy. And so part of that is union organizing. Part of that is educating one another, like you guys do, you, John, and Mary do on a regular basis. And that's where we're headed. Also, lastly, I would just say is, we are suffering a twofold crisis coming down the pike. Assuming we make it out of nuclear war, assuming all these hair-trigger nuclear weapons do not wipe us out first, we are still facing a climate catastrophe, and we are still facing ecosystem collapse in many portions of the world. And that's the ruling class will not be able to govern when that stuff goes down. And so that will open up opportunities at the local, state, and regional level for more governance and for more independent free will and free action. And unfortunately, it's a crisis situation, and I'm not advocating for anything, and I'm not looking forward to this stuff. But it will the ruling class, no matter how with it they will not be able to govern when ecosystems are collapsing and when there are climate refugees and this and that. So.
Christian, you mentioned state and local government, but I also want to put in a plug for our Congressman Jared Huffman, who has his town hall meeting tonight. I looked at the progressive scorecard. He gets among the highest scores in all of Congress, in the high 90s, for his progressive voting record. We are very lucky to have a guy who is not just a leader in the Progressive Caucus in Congress, but also is the founder and co-chair of what's called the Free Thought Caucus, which advocates for protecting secular government institutions from corporate assault. Jared Kaufman, again, has his town hall meeting tonight, and I really hope listeners tune in. Once again, that phone number is 833-261-6164 between 5:30 and 6:30 tonight. Christian, my brother, you're doing great work. Mary is going to thank you as well. And we want to know, where can listeners find out more about your great work?
My website is War Industry Muster, MUSTER, all one word, .com. And you can go to the Eisenhower Media Network, where I and many of my peace-oriented veteran peers are looking to create some space in the narrative for a demilitarized foreign policy and a foreign policy that no longer harms the international working class. And so Eisenhower Media Network and warindustrymuster.com.
Wonderful. Well, you've been a terrific guest, and we would love to have you back at some point. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, John.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays,
Likewise.
my brother.
We've been speaking with Christian Sorensen, who is an independent journalist and researcher mainly focused on war profiteering within the military, industrial, and congressional complex. He is an Air Force veteran, and he's the author of Understanding the War Industry. So, Mr. Sorensen is also a senior fellow at the Eisenhower Media Network, which he referenced, and that is an organization of independent veteran military and national security experts. So check it out. And as he said, his website, warindustrymuster.com. Thank you so much for listening. Just a program note, John, we will be back on December 30th.
Yes, we will.
With our last show of the year with our wonderful engineer, Dorothy. And we will say goodbye now, but we will return. We hope that you'll join us on December 30th, followed by our hopeful show with Congressman Huffman on January 6th, 1 year after the insurrection. So it'll be interesting to hear his take on those things. Happy holidays to everyone. We wish you a safe, healthy, and blessed holiday season.